Most Americans recognize the name Thomas Paine, but in Britain, many people have never heard of him. And yet few individuals had a greater influence on the birth of the United States. Before he wrote Common Sense, before he inspired a revolution, before he became one of the most influential political writers of the 18th century, Thomas Paine lived in the East Sussex town of Lewes. Today, in that very same town, Bull House, the house he lived in, preserves the story of those 6 formative years and explores how a struggling excise officer became a voice that would help change the world. To learn more about Paine, his time in Lewes, and his influential writing, I traveled to Bull House and spoke with its director, Leanne O'Boyle.
Thomas Paine, I think, is interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think it's fascinating that most British people have no idea who he is, whereas most Americans at least recognise the name. Of course, in Lewes it's a bit different because he's everywhere in Lewes. But I think that's because what you have there is a man who helped us lose America and then called for the abolition of the monarchy. So we don't teach him in schools alongside subjects we're more comfortable with, like the Tudors and the Second World War, which I think is a crying shame, because whilst he was technically a traitor, doesn't mean that he didn't have a point in a lot of ways. And that is actually what made him quite dangerous to the authorities, because a lot of people thought he had a point. And I do think the phrase "man ahead of his time" is bandied around far too much. But I think with Paine, it is actually accurate. I know I'm biased, but still I will stand by that statement. So when he comes to Philadelphia, what you have there is largely a penniless British immigrant with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, but no other connections that we're aware of at the moment. And his life has collapsed here. He's leaving behind a life in tatters. But a year later, he publishes something that just sets the world aflame. That is an extraordinary, compelling story.
It's easy to think of Paine only as a revolutionary figure. But when he arrived in Lewes in 1768, there was little to suggest the impact he would eventually have. He was an excise officer collecting taxes on behalf of the crown, a government employee struggling to build a stable life for himself. Yet, Lewes would prove to be the place where his political ideas would begin to take shape.
Thomas Paine came to Lewes in 1768, and he kind of couldn't have arrived in a town better suited, with the benefit of hindsight, to the man he goes on to become. Lewes always had a bit of a radical Republican undercurrent to it. Back in the 13th century, it was the site of a really important battle where Simon de Montfort and the barons took on the king and won. They were trying to make them honour the terms of Magna Carta. They capture the king and his heir, and they make him enshrine it properly in law. So what happened here really helped to form the basis of parliamentary democracy, not immediately, but the foundations of parliamentary democracy in Britain. So Paine arrives in Lewes, and he takes a room here at Bull House. This is frequently called Tom Paine's house. It wasn't his house. He was a tenant here. So he arrives in a household with a very well-connected family who can introduce him to the local people and help him kind of get his feet under the table, which he does in a very big way.
The Lewes Paine encountered was small in size but rich in political debate. Here he joined local institutions, participated in civic life, and discovered something that would become central to his later writing, that ordinary people could govern themselves. The lessons he learned in town meetings and debating societies would later reappear in his arguments for representative government and independence.
If you look at a map of the 18th century, it really is just the spine of the high street with a few roads coming off of it. But the fact is, Lewes was a hugely cosmopolitan county town, a really important local, an important town in the area. He's got a steady job. It doesn't pay so well, but it's a steady, respected job. He also goes into business with his landlord's daughter, which as an excise officer you shouldn't do because you're taking on debt. He is participating in local government, sitting on the court leet, the town hall meetings, the vestry meetings over the road in the church. I think really speaks to his personality in quite a big way, because this isn't government in a way that is really big and self-aggrandizing, although he did quite enjoy the adulation of feeling terribly clever. This is government at a really basic local level. They're talking about funding the clock tower, the bell tower, which periodically you will hear chime every 15 minutes. They're talking about how much money to give to widows, orphans, whether they're going to let wheelbarrows on the high street. So he here is realizing that people can rule themselves. They can govern their own communities.
Paine wasn't learning politics from books alone. He was learning from everyday life, debating ideas, solving practical problems, and seeing how the communities functioned. At the same time, he was developing the communication skills that would later make him one of the most effective political writers of his generation.
This moment in his life is that bit just before he steps onto the world stage. So the story I'm excited about telling here in Bull House is really Paine as a human being. He does go on to do extraordinary things, but he is just a human being, and he builds a life for himself here. While Paine is here, we already knew that he was submitting articles to the local newspaper anonymously. He participates in the first example of national unionised action anywhere in the world. So this is a really, really big deal. The excise officers hadn't had a pay rise in a century since the service was set up after the English Civil War. So you're asking these men to collect money from the government, not a very popular job because you're asking people for money, braving highwaymen and the riots to go and collect money and expecting them to not be corrupt and maybe take backhanders, which is exactly what was happening. The service was horribly corrupt, but they couldn't afford to feed their children. And that is the argument that Paine makes in this pamphlet, that they're not inherently bad people, but what do you expect them to do if they can't feed their children? So he also, whilst he's here, really cuts his teeth as an orator. There is a tavern just down the high street called the White Hart Inn. He would meet every week the White Hart Evening Club. This was guys locally would meet to debate issues of the day, and there was a competitive element to it. And if you won, you were gifted the next day a copy of Homer, so either the Iliad or the Odyssey. And inscribed on the inside, it would say, and I'm paraphrasing, but the Headstrong Club Book of Obstinacy, awarded to the most obstinate haranguer, and then it would have the person's name. But then they added, revised and corrected by Thomas Paine, because he won it so often. So with that club, he wasn't just learning how to be right and to think critically. He was thinking about how do you actually communicate in a way that is going to move people, is going to convince them that you are right. Do you bring in humour? What is going to motivate them? And you certainly see that realised to its fullest power when he's in Philadelphia and he publishes Common Sense.
When he left England for Philadelphia in 1774, he carried with him ideas, some of them radical, that had been shaped in this town. Within 2 years, he would publish a pamphlet that helped change the course of history.
With Common Sense, he's deliberately not writing it for political movers and shakers and high thinkers. He's targeting this deliberately at normal people. To our eyes, it seems a bit more convoluted 18th century language, but at the time, this was language that ordinary people could read, understand. He was targeting it at them, which meant the thing spread like wildfire. Most people had either read it or had it read aloud to them. It was being discussed and debated in taverns and coffee houses. I think there are things he says in it that I think are not wholly fair. However, as a work of rhetoric, it is quite extraordinary. And I think he understood the impact he wanted to have and how to achieve it. There are things in there that I think should be quite uncomfortable to modern eyes. So alongside the incredibly inspiring, snappy one-liners like "we have it in our power to begin the world over again" and "the sun never shone on a cause of greater worth," he is also deliberately riling mob hatred and violence, which is also always a dangerous game, especially in the colonies when the mob were quite enthusiastic already at that time. He gifted the colonists the language of revolution and the energy and the vision. And 6 months later, they've agreed the Declaration of Independence. He's not the only reason it happens, but I can't see that without Common Sense, you have that outcome in July 1776.
Thomas Paine's story is often told as an American one. But before Philadelphia, before Common Sense, and before independence, there was Lewes. It was here that Paine developed the ideas and confidence that would help shape a revolution. As the United States marks 250 years of independence, places like Bull House remind us that the story of America's founding is a transatlantic one that begins in towns like Lewes and continues to resonate on both sides of the Atlantic. To learn more about Bull House and the America250 UK project, visit our website at America250UK.org.